In November 2025, inside a military facility in Beijing, Russian soldiers gathered around a scale model of a nuclear reactor while a Chinese instructor walked them through it. For 3 weeks, China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, drilled those men in a single discipline: how to keep functioning on ground soaked in radiation, chemical agents, and biological contamination. Beijing denies the whole thing outright. Moscow's answer, delivered through a senior lawmaker, is even blunter, and the European Union says it happened anyway, which leaves the question: why does Russia, heir to the largest contaminated battlefield force ever assembled, need China to teach it how to survive a nuclear battlefield? The answer reaches back to an army the Soviet Union built and then let rot. And it reaches forward to an assumption at the heart of American strategy, an assumption now quietly coming under pressure. Start with what is actually on the record. On July 1st, 2026, Reuters published an exclusive, a secret Chinese military training program for Russian forces, approved at the highest level and involving at least 4 Russian and Chinese generals. The reporting rests on 2 European officials and on classified Russian documents reviewed by Reuters, documents no other outlet has seen, a caveat worth keeping in hand. The paper trail starts a year earlier. On July 2, 2025, Major General Rustam Kusainov of Russia and Senior Colonel Sun Dayun of China signed the framework agreement. In August 2025, Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov authorized the program by internal decree, and by late 2025, roughly 200 Russian soldiers had cycled through training in China, some of whom, Reuters reported on May 19th, have since returned to combat in Ukraine. Trained in Beijing in the autumn, back on the line by winter. Most of that training this video will come back to. One course stands apart. In November 2025, at a military facility in Beijing, Russian troops sat through 3 weeks of instruction in radiological, chemical, and biological defense, RCB for short. The opening of one course was attended by Major General Li Jin-sun, who heads the People's Liberation Army's academy dedicated to exactly that discipline. The Russian delegation was led by Colonel General Rustam Muradov, Deputy Commander of Russia's ground forces. Now the denials, because there are 2, and both are categorical. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the relevant allegations are entirely unfounded. In Moscow, Andrei Kartapolov, chairman of the State Duma's Defense Committee, told the broadcaster RTVI that the report was complete nonsense, adding that Russia has nothing to learn from China. Both statements come from the capitals with the most riding on the answer, and they carry the natural caveats of any wartime denial. Weeks before the deepest details surfaced, on June 15, 2026, the European Union's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, said Brussels had confirmed through its own channels that the training took place, which leaves the stranger question, not whether Russia trained in China, but why this subject of all subjects. Because the country taking notes in a Beijing classroom is the country that wrote the original textbook. In 1989, the Soviet Union's chemical troops numbered 50,000 men. By the count compiled at the Federation of American Scientists, the largest force of its kind on Earth, not the largest in the Warsaw Pact. The largest anywhere, full stop. They operated roughly 30,000 armored vehicles fitted for nuclear, biological, and chemical reconnaissance. And the doctrine was the unsettling part. Western armies of the Cold War treated nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons mainly as something to deter. Soviet doctrine, as Western studies of its chemical warfare posture documented, treated the contaminated battlefield as something to fight through. Its exercises simulated the fallout of tactical nuclear strikes and drilled formations to keep advancing across ground that had just been hit. The plan was not to avoid the nuclear battlefield. The plan was to keep fighting across it. That capability was not theoretical. Americans of a certain generation remember where they were in April 1986, when Chernobyl broke into the news. Fewer remember who Moscow sent in: the chemical troops under General Vladimir Pekolov, conducting the radiation cleanup, the clearest real-world demonstration that force ever gave. Then the Soviet Union died, and the force withered with it. Renamed the NBC Defense Troops in 1992, it went almost straight onto the cutting block. The 1996 reform program projected a reduction to roughly 10,500 men by the year 2000. Run that math. 50,000 down to 10,500, a cut of roughly 80% in barely a decade, to the one force on the planet purpose-built for surviving a nuclear battlefield. The doctrine survived on paper. The force built to execute it did not. Strip away the acronym, and radiation, chemical, and biological defense is 3 jobs performed against 3 invisible threats. Reconnaissance, detecting radiological, chemical, or biological contamination before it kills, finding what no eye can see. Decontamination, scrubbing troops, vehicles, and equipment back into the fight. And protection, keeping contamination out of lungs, out of crew compartments, out of the systems that keep a force alive. Russia still fields a dedicated branch for all of this, the Radiation, Chemical, and Biological Defense Troops, a branch whose mission Russia's defense ministry still defines in exactly those 3 terms. The lawmaker said Russia has nothing to learn from China. The defense minister's own decree apparently disagreed. And the Reuters reporting is specific about what happened in Beijing. Russian personnel watching a Chinese instructor, examining a scale model of a nuclear reactor, practicing chemical reconnaissance, radiation reconnaissance, and the protection of ventilation systems against contamination. Ventilation sounds mundane, until the air itself carries the threat, and a filter is what stands between a crew and the ground it is driving across. That is what surviving a nuclear battlefield actually looks like. Not a wonder weapon. Filters, detectors, and drills. Every item on that list comes straight from the reporting, and every item is defensive. Why does that one course matter more than everything taught around it? Because of what teaching it signals. One of the European officials told Reuters that including radiological, chemical, and biological instruction underscored the strategic nature of the exchange. This is a subject militaries everywhere treat as particularly sensitive, close to the core of how a state plans for the worst day of a war. The analyst Irina Tsukerman, writing for the Robert Lansing Institute, the day the story broke, pushed the point further. The specific subjects matter more than the general fact of cooperation because they are the technical foundation for operating near damaged industrial sites, around nuclear installations, and inside contaminated zones. One caution belongs here, stated plainly. The same analyst assesses that Russian nuclear use remains unlikely. Nothing in this training points toward preparing an attack. Everything in it points toward keeping forces functional in a contaminated environment, surviving the battlefield, not creating it. But defensive knowledge can still carry a strategic message, because this course did not travel alone, and the company it kept is where the picture widens. According to Reuters' May 19th report, the roughly 200 Russians trained in China worked mostly on drone warfare, alongside electronic warfare, army aviation, armored infantry tactics, explosives handling, demining and counter-drone operations, RCB defense, that is radiological, chemical, and biological defense, was one course among many, and the reporting does not say how many of the 200 took it. By volume, this was a drone school. By sensitivity, the contamination course sat at the very top. That framing matters. This was not a nuclear boot camp with a drone elective. It was a drone school where the most guarded classroom taught survival. The wider pattern is measurable. On February 4th, 2022, 20 days before Russian columns crossed into Ukraine, Moscow and Beijing declared their partnership had no limits. The military half of that promise shows up in the numbers. The Council on Foreign Relations counts 15 joint Russia-China exercises between 2022 and August 2024, against 9 in the 3 years from 2012 to 2014. The tempo nearly doubled while one of the partners was fighting a war. That is not a friendship of convenience drifting apart under pressure. It is one tightening under it. So is this systematic or a one-off favor between friends? Analysts split. One reading, the Robert Lansing Institute's, sees a war support ecosystem maturing, an operational relationship running beneath the diplomatic cover, with China extracting lessons from Russia's combat experience even as it teaches. Another, from the Center for European Policy Analysis, stresses the asymmetry, China dominant, calibrating every increment of support to preserve its own autonomy, never handing Moscow more than serves Beijing. Both readings can be true at once. And either way, the conclusion lands on the same desk in Washington. Put the pieces on one table. The heir to the largest contaminated battlefield force ever built, hollowed out by 80%, travels to China for the most sensitive course on the syllabus, inside a partnership running joint exercises at nearly twice the old tempo. The direction of expertise has reversed. The student of 2025 is the power that once kept 50,000 men for this exact job. Whatever else that is, it is two nuclear-armed militaries aligning at the highest rung of the escalation ladder, not rehearsing how to climb it, but making sure both could endure what waits at the top. And that is where the assumption planted at the start of this video comes under pressure. For 3 decades after the Cold War, American strategy rested on a firebreak, a wide, bright line between conventional war and nuclear war, so costly to cross that planning past, it felt unnecessary. Deterrence held the line, and nobody trained hard for the far side of it. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies argue that line is eroding. Russia and China are both investing in theater-range systems able to carry conventional or nuclear warheads, exactly the tools that make limited regional nuclear use below the strategic threshold thinkable. A military that trains seriously to operate through contamination is a military hedging against a world where that firebreak is no longer guaranteed. And the lesson travels. The Robert Lansing Institute's warning is that the model itself, incremental, technical, deniable support that stops short of open alliance, feeds authoritarian confidence in gray zone escalation, informing Chinese calculations in the Indo-Pacific, above all around Taiwan. The Western response now under debate runs in mirror image: rebuild allied radiological, chemical, and biological defenses, and tighten NATO's own integration of conventional and nuclear planning, arguments coming from CSIS and the Atlantic Council alike. And if that is what Russia carried home from Beijing, consider what Beijing kept. Analysts already argue the PLA, with no recent combat experience of its own, has been studying a modern war by proxy. Drones, electronic warfare, attrition, all of it filed away for a very different theater. What China learned from Ukraine and what it means for Taiwan, that is the next video.